Hello and welcome to Property TV. My name's Stephen Galpin and this is Property Matters. Today we're very lucky to have with us Gráinne Gilmore, who is Head of Research at Zoopla. For those that don't know, Zoopla is one of our major portals in this country, favoured by estate agents and of course well respected for the information they provide us. Now, Gráinne's produced a report on the last 12 months in the rental market and Gráinne, welcome. That's what we're going to talk to you about. I'm going to go to your report and I'm going to start off with the headlines and the overriding and rather shocking headline for us here in London is that there's an 8% drop in change in rents over the last 12 years. Now this does apply to London and we'll talk about the other areas later. Your conclusion is that, if I have it correctly, that most of this has been caused by an exodus from central London of the workers that perhaps have apartments here for convenience for work on the weekdays, the lack of travellers coming into London, therefore the sort of Airbnb usage has gone down. Have I picked that up correctly?
Yes, that's certainly one strand of the trend that we're seeing. So the one thing that we're seeing in the London market, especially in the central zones, and I would be just really like to highlight that we're seeing a really stratified picture right across London. So in the central zones, we're seeing this trend of a rise in supply, and that is putting downward pressure on rents. So some of the areas, as you've just mentioned, why are we seeing that rise in supply? Why did that bulge in supply happen during the summer last year? It was those short lets that kind of reliant on tourism, business travel, all coming into the longer let market. And then you also have people, a cohort of renters who are looking to live in a different space or live in a different location because of the change in working trends that we've seen, especially in the central zones. And we're seeing that in other major cities as well, not just London. But within London, we're seeing it in these central zones. And the reason we know that is because the downward pressure on rents around Kensington and Chelsea, Westminster, Camden, Islington, all kind of 8, 9, over 10% fall in rents, while in outer London, some of the outer London boroughs, we're still seeing rental growth of up to 4%. So it's a really mixed picture across London emanating from the centre.
If I can just put to you some of my concerns about the market and the questioning of some of the figures. If we take house sales, I can quite see that through all this pandemic, people could easily say, well, I'll sell my expensive London property, I'll move out to the country, I'm doing 4 days at home anyway, my commute might only be for 1 or 2 days a week now, so it sort of makes sense, and I'm going to put several £1,000s into my pocket, okay? So I can understand this sort of, it's not downsizing, but sort of moving out sizing. So I can understand that logic. I'm not sure in my mind that works quite so well in the rental market, because moving costs money. However you do it, it costs money. Now you might be saving on your rent moving out to the country, but of course you're not going to have the choice of rental properties, are you? So how sustainable is this move out of the centre of London?
It's a really interesting point, because I think some of the narrative has been, especially in the sales market, maybe moving from the very centre of a city right out into rural areas. Now we've seen some of that. There's some areas near areas of outstanding natural beauty where we've seen exponential rise in demand off a very low base. So we can see there's a cohort of buyers who might be doing that. But to take your point in the rental sector, what our report really shows is that people are moving maybe into the wider commuter zone. We have seen some areas around the country, really rural areas, that have seen a jump up in demand, but as I say, from a really low base. But what we have seen very sustained trends, and this is in London, in Leeds, in Manchester, Birmingham. You've got the centre of the city, so that's the very central local authority, if you like, or in London, it's the very centre of inner London. You've seen the negative pressure on rents, but what you've seen is a sort of halo effect of people moving just a bit further down the road. And the reason that we think that the demand for space is underpinning that is because we can see that the market for family homes in the rental market is moving much more quickly. So compared to the last quarter of 2019, in the last quarter of 2020, family homes were being snapped up 30% more quickly in the rental market than the year before. Flats were also moving slightly faster, but only 2% faster. So there is demand in the rental market for everything, but we can see that demand for space is being reflected in the data as it's appearing to us. So if that answers your questions, it's not a whole scale exodus, and we know that from our data. We can tell that people who are looking within city centres, most of them are still going to stay within the city centre, but there is a cohort of renters who are perhaps moving further afield to get a bigger house for the same money, or perhaps to have access to a garden. As you say, moving costs money, but having spent so long within their four walls in lockdown, renters are also wanting to make that move within the rental sector. It's not just buyers who are searching for more space. That's what our data seems to be suggesting.
Okay, and can I just, for the sake of clarity, understand, for my mind, and perhaps the mind of some of our viewers, it's very easy to take figures and perhaps you're an expert at it, but put the wrong assumptions to them. And in the sales market again, which I'll just refer to, you see you have at your disposal a huge array of estate agents who go onto your portal, and so you've got a fantastic source of information there. But if we take sales, for instance, now, if you say to a London agent, a big London agent, okay, you're selling 20, 30 properties a week, and what percentage are to people moving into London, or is it because people are moving out of London, you've got these properties on your books? If you ask the same question of a country agent who might be in a very small town, might sell on average 3 or 4 properties a week, and 2 of them are from people moving out of London, you're going to get a figure that says 50% of his custom is being fueled by people moving out of London, which is going to give us a very false mental picture of actually what's happening. And that is happening to some extent in the sales market. So I'm interested to know your view on the lesser effect of the rental market in the country, because there are fewer properties, there are few people wanting to rent. As you've identified, people are looking for space if they go to the country, otherwise there's not much point in moving. So how do you calculate that into your assumptions?
It's a good point, because percentages can tell you all sorts of things, and that's why you may notice I'm very careful to say off a very low base. So whenever there are those calculations, if we're doing a countrywide, we would be careful to flag up that when you're talking about London, Manchester, Leeds, these are the biggest rental markets in the UK, Birmingham as well. So when you get out to those rural areas, yes, you're talking about a much smaller sample size, so it's not like for like, but it is notable. It's worth noting that in some of these areas we would have a cutoff point for our data. If it's below that number, we wouldn't even refer to it. So we would have a basic level of activity that we would need to achieve before we would start commenting on changes in trends. It's a good flag up. But in terms of, I would come back to my point on cities, as as you have said, we can see where people are based and where they're looking. And we know from our data that most people within the cities are still looking within cities. So there is a movement in the market of the cohort who are active, who are moving, who are looking elsewhere. But I think in the rental sector, it's worth coming back to rental changes. So again, let's move away from activity where you're saying, oh, well, it could be you could see trends emerging that aren't really reflective. If we just look at what's happening to rents, you can see that halo effect because of the pressure. The demand pressure is pushing up rents because of the lack of choice in those areas surrounding the cities, the kind of close and wider commuter zones. Whereas in the city centre, you can see the greater level of choice is putting downward pressure on rents themselves.
Now, just bringing you back to the London market, as we touched on earlier, perhaps some of the increase in stock, and therefore the downward driver for prices, is the fact that we don't have the tourists, and the operations like Airbnb and many others in that sort of market are not being fulfilled. Effectively, short-term lets in central London are a no-no. They're an unlawful let under 3 months. So how much of that Airbnb market is a false market that shouldn't be there anyway. How do you calculate that into your figures?
I wouldn't be able to speak to a false market or not. All I can talk about is what our data is showing us. And we know that there's been a lot of supply into the long let market. So there are some people operating maybe shorter lets, business lets, and they could see at the end of the first lockdown or during the first lockdown that the landscape had completely changed because of COVID. So you're looking at a market now with very little tourism, no tourism then as we moved into the summer. You're looking at a market where people are working from home much more. And so your thought might be, I don't want this property sitting empty. I'm going to move into the mainstream rental market. Well, we have very little visibility on what they were doing before, but we know that a lot of supply came on in that sector. And it also was the case in Edinburgh as well. And we spoke to agents on the ground and we could see that it was people who perhaps were offering landlords who were offering shorter lets moving into the long let market. And that's when our data starts to pick them up. So we could see that that trend came in, and that's why you had a bulge in supply and rents falling in Edinburgh, rents falling in central London.
Of course, the difference in rent between a short-term holiday let and a normal long-term let, that's going to be depressed in itself, isn't it? It's going to cause a downward trend.
That means because more supply is coming in, creating more choice, putting that negative pressure on rents.
Yeah, we trailed the programme. We trailed your presence coming on through our social media platforms, and we've been inundated with questions, particularly from landlords wanting to know where we're going for 2021 and beyond. Landlords in the buy-to-let market, especially at the lesser end, the individual landlords or those with 2 or 3 properties, have really had quite a bad time over the last couple of years. The supply of properties through big developments like here in Canary Wharf, where I think we're expected to see around about 20,000 new properties coming onto the market over the next couple of years. That's caused a downward pressure. We've had income tax changes to the rental market which haven't favoured the smaller investor. We've also had a government that is trying to, I think, discourage the smaller individual buy-to-lets landlords and encourage the institutional landlords. I presume, I'm not a politician, but I'm guessing that it's because limited companies and bigger institutions are easy to monitor in terms of tax collection. And I'm afraid the property industry has always been quite famous for avoidance of tax through either sort of small landlords not really understanding the situation and failing to declare proper rents and things. So it's a very complex situation, but in short, the smaller landlords had a pretty difficult 12 or 18 months. And they all want to know, is it going to get better?
It's certainly true that individual landlords and landlords as a whole have seen big tax changes, and we have seen the impact of that since 2016 when the additional stamp duty was introduced. We can see that mortgage lending and mortgage approvals for individual buy-to-let landlords have come down. So there is this kind of hum of constrained supply as a result. So that is always going to put a floor under rents as we move into 2021. So big macro factors that we have to consider. You've got the constrained supply of less people investing as individual landlords. Now, you may have individual landlords who already have several properties who can see one-off opportunities and are adding to their portfolio, and that makes sense for them. But since the introduction of the stamp duty, those mortgage lending figures for buy-to-let landlords, you can't argue with them. You can see a big drop. So there's constrained supply, which is always going to put a floor under rents. At the same time, the demand levels in the rental market, yes, at the people in the younger end of the rental market who are looking at a more mixed picture when it comes to employment prospects, especially around retail, hospitality, as we move through the year. There could be less people moving into the rental sector. More people may be staying at home as a result of that employment change. But at the same time, access to mortgage finance for those stepping out of the rental sector, perhaps into first-time ownership, mortgage finance availability for them is constrained at the moment. So you could have more people staying in the sector for longer, which means there will be demand. And again, against that constrained supply, that will put a floor under rents in the main, on average, across the UK. But what you can see from our report is that there is a very localized picture when it comes to rents. So I think landlords will be reviewing their portfolios depending on where they're based and what the outlooks are in their area, in their city. Are they in the inner city? Are they in the commutersville? What I do feel is, though, that COVID has prompted a change in working practices that we may have taken 10 years to get to without it. I do feel that we will come back to offices. City centres will grow up again. None of us can wait to get out to a restaurant, go to the theatre, be in the middle of things again. But at the same time, the flexibility that we have with work, the ability to work from home maybe 1 or 2 days a week, does mean that the opportunity will be there for some renters to live further away from the office, for those office-based workers, to live further away than perhaps they would have before. So there is more opportunity in wider commuter zones perhaps than there was this time last year.
It's a very good answer. I talk to the boys and the guys that work and guys and girls that work in the city here in Canary Wharf. And whilst they all thought it was rather fun to work from home for a little while, they can't wait to get back to the cappuccinos and the cafes and the restaurants and the Friday night socialising. You know, it's really missing from their lives at the moment. And this is why, as I sort of asked you earlier, how sustainable this working from home really is. I mean, again, just on a personal example, I used to live in Henley-on-Thames and commute into London. And I think that's a 15-minute journey, and wow, it's amazing. Until you're standing on the station and they say, I'm terribly sorry, but the 6:15 from Henley isn't running today because the train lines are not suitable or whatever, for whatever reason they say. And what are you faced with? £100 taxi ride or just not going into work that day? So it's not always as simple as people make out, moving out of town and adding to the commute. But I suppose the saving grace this time is that if people have it in their mind that they may be at home for 3 or 4 days and commute in 1 or 2 days, then I can see the logic of that, and I can see that that's relatively practical. But I think you're right. I think the mood does change from time to time, and it'll change until we get some solid answers about when we either come out of lockdown or what effect the vaccines are having, I suppose. And I guess it'll be the same in the sales market. So, I mean, overall, if you were a London landlord, would you be extremely worried about the next 12 months or 24 months, or would you think there is light at the end of the tunnel?
There is demand in the sector. We can see that. It just depends where you're based in London, as I said, a very localised market. But looking through the pandemic, looking through COVID, and we are closer to the end, it feels now, than the beginning, we will see a return to city centre life. We can see it elsewhere. We can see in the Isle of Man, everyone's out enjoying themselves. I think we'll have to live alongside this virus for some time, but we will have an opening up and some sort of return to perhaps a new normality. So it just depends where your properties are. There is demand in the sector, but where we can see there's been supply coming in, you can see that's negative pressure on rates. When we get back to normality, you could potentially see some of that supply exit again, and that again could put a floor under pricing. What we are also seeing in some of the central London zones is that the monthly declines in some of these very central areas are starting to ease. So for London as a whole, the monthly decline that we saw in December was the smallest decline that we'd seen in 9 months. So it really picked up pace over the summer and has started to recede again. And that sort of indicates that even with this level of supply we see in the London market at the moment, the rents themselves have kind of normalised to take that into account. So we could see those annual declines start to ease off as we move through 2021. So I think, as with all of us, for all aspects of our life, but also looking at the sales market, looking at the rental market in particular, when you're in those city centres, it's looking through what's going to happen to COVID into the summer and beyond into 2021. The rental market trends will be dependent on when that vaccine rollout really goes gung-ho and gets us out or back into some sort of city life that we're used to.
Okay. Well, a lot of people we talk to here on Property TV are landlords, and a lot of them started off as London landlords and have started to invest in places like Liverpool, Birmingham, Manchester. Why? Because investment prices are less. Actually, yields are actually higher by comparison. But I've never been convinced that's a terribly safe sort of outlook, really. I have a lot of friends that look and say, well, if you can't see the telecom tower, don't do it. because London's safe, because it's always a regenerating market. If there's not one part of the country that's renting or buying in London, there'll always be somebody else. It's an international and a multicultural city. I'm not sure the same applies in the north of England, but you are saying that there are modest increases in rental values the further north we're going. Will that maintain?
You can see some of those major cities, we're starting to see just a very minor fall, minus 0.8, minus 0.9 on the year in the city centre for Birmingham, LA, for Manchester, LA. But look at all the neighbouring local authorities.
Yeah, sorry, that's your halo effect, isn't it, again?
Yes, exactly. So looking at all the other local authorities, in Birmingham, for instance, you're looking at a 5% rise on average. I would say these are big cities. These are big centres for the rental market. I mean, London is the biggest rental market, but these cities all have significant rental markets and demand for rents there, and a move towards people living in those city centres. You've got big employers who've moved up to Birmingham over the last 3 or 4 years. You've got Salford near Manchester. So you've got a lot of regeneration, a lot of business investment going on there. So there's still very large rental markets and significant when we look at the data.
And you feel that will continue?
The demand for rental property in those cities looks set to continue. Again, it comes back to this wider theme I talked about, with people not maybe bouncing out and taking that first step into home ownership just at the moment with the mortgage finance situation the way it is. So there'll be kind of bigger demand, and with constrained investment in some areas through buy to let, and some people may be going up there, but overall we just know that the level of investment has dropped over the last couple of years, so that will always kind of keep a floor under. So there's no reason to suspect that those cities won't continue to grow. And as you say, affordability levels are so much greater up in the north, it gives more headroom for rental growth.
Gráinne, I see from your report that you're saying that 32% of salary would be the typical figure to set against rental payments. So a third of somebody's wages are going to go on rents. Do you think that would apply to the younger generation or right the way through the age spectrum?
That's a typical average right the way through the age spectrum in the rental market. And as you move further north, that number's going to come down. And as you move down to the south, that number's going to go up. And obviously, then if you're living with someone else, that number's going to go down as a proportion of your joint salary. But yeah, that's an average across the board.
I'm thinking that's quite an interesting question for a young person to ask, for instance, if they're looking at getting a relatively high mortgage and comparing it with a rent, and also particularly perhaps more pertinent if they're going in for anything like this sort of co-ownership where you half rent, half mortgage. Actually your costs can be considerably higher than a straightforward sale and a straightforward rental. The only difference is that you're not having to put down so much deposit, I suppose, really.
That's the key question, isn't it? It's the deposit. So mortgage rates may be very low at the moment. So once you can get past the hurdle of a deposit, your mortgage payments may be relatively modest for your 2-year fixed period, but it's that hurdle of the deposit. And we were moving towards a market where there was much more choice for 95% mortgages, for 90% mortgages. And then we had the pandemic, and we've seen that choice, it is starting to widen again. But the first thing that happened was that a lot of that choice narrowed for people who had smaller deposits. So that is where the hurdle is. It's whether you've got the savings behind you to be able to go to a bank and ask for a loan, and you've got a 10%, 15, 20% deposit ready to go to buy a house.
Gráinne, I don't want to put words into your mouth, but it sounds like there is light at the end of the tunnel. And I think the pleasing thing is that you have answers to all these particular trends that we're experiencing at the moment. And I think that's quite comforting for a lot of people. I always feel if you can identify the problem properly, then you know what you need to do to either cater for it or solve it. So, Gráinne, I want to thank Zoopla for allowing you to come on. I want to thank you for all your figures and information. I'm sure there are a lot of people that are going to be very interested in what you've had to say today, and thank you for your time.
Pleasure.
I'm Stephen Galpin, that was Property Matters. Thank you for watching. See you next time.